Today, what we're going to be talking about are rhetorical situations. Now, rhetoric is what we're going to be looking at throughout the entire year. So, what is rhetoric? That's really kind of the main question. Rhetoric is, as defined, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Essentially, rhetoric means, from that fancy definition, the stylistic choices with words and syntax, grammar, and other things that an author makes in order to persuade their audience, to convince them of some point of their purpose. So, when you look at rhetoric, and that's what we're going to be doing throughout the entire year, we're going to be studying rhetoric and looking at it in speeches, novels, poems, everything. TVs, movie, images, poster, art, it's everywhere. And we're going to be studying it and looking at it in order to hone our analytical skills and also for the fun of it. Because honestly, it is actually pretty fun once you get into it. As we look at rhetoric throughout the year, we're going to examine different types of text. Now, what's a text? That's kind of a broad term, and we're going to use it in a fairly broad way. We're going to say a text is anything that you can read, that you can consume and analyze. So that could be everything from a poem, a novel, a speech, even to a piece of art, a Monet, a painting, a movie poster, a political cartoon. There are a lot of other things that don't necessarily involve words that still use rhetoric, that still appeal to us and use those devices that we're going to learn about and can still be talked about and analyzed rhetorically. So we're going to look at all sorts of things, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to call it all texts. Now, what we're going to focus on at the beginning now, we're going to work chronologically throughout all of our pieces throughout this year. So we're going to focus on Pilgrims. We're going to start with the Puritans who came over from England to America. We're going to start with their pieces first in order to prepare us for the Scarlet Letter. And specifically, the lady we're going to start with is Anne Bradstreet. So we'll focus on analyzing her rhetorically. Before we can actually look at who she was as an author and how we're supposed to read her poems or how they could be analyzed, first we need to get some basic vocabulary down. So that's what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about some basic vocab. What sort of vocabulary are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about the main things that you're always going to have to look for. And there is a term that's used every once in a while that we're going to use in order to kind of help you keep straight all these basic terms you're going to know. And it's called Space Cat. Meow. Space Cat essentially stands for speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence, rhetorical choices, appeals, and tone. Now, we're not going to talk about all of these today, but get familiar with that phrase, Space Cat, because we're going to use it a lot. But we're going to cover the first 5 of those, the space. And to talk about those, I'm going to first kind of talk about occasion, context, purpose, and this really fancy word called exigence. So let's first talk about what occasion means. And essentially, occasion, context, purpose, and exigence are all the elements of a rhetorical situation that are surrounding a piece and help motivate an author in some form or another. So we'll start with occasion. Essentially, occasion is anything from like the specific circumstances, atmosphere of the time, attitudes, events surrounding the creation of a text. It could be all sorts of things. What are examples of occasion? It could be anything from an author losing their mother. She just passed away, so I wrote a poem about it. It could be anything like that. It could be the election of a president. An occasion could be anything that surrounds the piece, and that may include prompting it. Now, what actually pushes an author to create something, that's called exigence. Really fancy word. It's not something you're going to use every day in conversation at a party, but it is an important one when we talk about rhetoric. And essentially an exigence is anything that pushes the author to create a piece. Very similar to occasion in many senses. The main difference is that an occasion doesn't necessarily move the author to create a piece, but an exigence does. Now that's the main difference. So we have occasion, specific circumstances surrounding a piece, exigence, the motivator for a piece. Context now is the historical, cultural, social movements that are going on at the time. It could be anything from like the Enlightenment, the Impressionist movement, the Modernist movement, during like certain philosophies that kind of describe and define a time period. But like I said, purpose is the goal of the speaker. What are they trying to convince the audience of? And it could be anything. It could be like, I want to convince the audience that climate change needs to be a serious issue that people vote on, or consider when choosing our next president. Like, you could be writing a speech and talking about that. You could be convincing someone. It could be even so innocuous as like why you should buy a certain brand of deodorant. It could be really any reason, grand or very mundane, whatever the author is trying to get across. Now, this relationship, I mentioned this like author and audience and like subject. These are also very important terms that kind of go into the basic understanding of a text when we look at it. And as we talk about that, what that really means, that kind of like special group of author, subject, and audience, that has a specific name. It's called a rhetorical triangle, or also the Aristotelian triangle, Aristotle's triangle, whatever you want to call it. It's a triangle. And we mentioned Aristotle before. He's one of those old Greek guys who's dead now, who was a philosopher, right up there with Socrates and Plato, who spoke a lot on both poetry and rhetoric, in addition to many other topics. But he described this relationship and kind of talked about it. So we're going to look at who is involved in this triangle, and kind of talk about their place in it. So as we examine these roles, first let's talk about the author, or also described as the speaker. It just depends on how you want to talk about it. This is the person who creates the text, whatever it may be. And like I said, text doesn't necessarily involve words. It could be a painting, it could be a movie, it could be a novel, a play, speech, whatever it may be. The author, the speaker, is the person who creates it. The audience is anyone that the speech is, or the text is intended for. So this could be really anyone. Someone you intend, someone that you don't necessarily intend. You could have multiple audiences as well, such as like if a president was speaking, maybe he speaks to his nation and he is addressing the people, and that would be his intended audience. But there could be like a secondary audience that may be unintended or even intended, of like the people of other nations as well, to understand like the diplomatic stance of the American nation or whatever country we're talking about here. Those could be different examples of audiences. So for an audience is anyone who's consuming the text, whatever the speaker, the author is putting out. And that could be really just about anything. So we could have multiple audiences, intended, unintended, all sorts. Now finally, the last corner of the triangle is the subject. And essentially all that is what's the topic? That's all it is. What's the topic of the text? That's all we really need to know. And at the center of this triangle is the text itself. So, and the subject could range from anything, and there isn't necessarily one like cut and dry subject. Like we look at the Scarlet Letter, it's about adultery. No, not necessarily. There are lots of other aspects and topics and subjects that are included in that text, in that novel, besides just adultery. So don't believe that, just like when talking about themes, that it's a book or a novel or a text is limited to one. No, we can have many, and we're going to talk about all of them. So get ready for that. So I realize that I have given you a lot of information at this point. I have given you about 7 terms to think about. That's a lot, I understand. But I want to say, don't worry. We're going to get through them. We're going to review them a lot. We're going to talk about them a lot. So this won't be the last time you see them. So don't worry about that. So just to review these 7 terms that we've covered, so we have occasion, context, purpose, exigence, speaker, audience, subject. All of these terms, I know a lot, are things that we're going to talk about as we move throughout this year. So although it is very overwhelming to learn 7 terms all at once, start to familiarize yourself with them. They're not going away. We're going to be talking about them quite a bit. So get used to it, and I will see y'all again next time. Adios.